I'd like to call the committee of the whole meeting for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, October 18th, 2016. Order with roll call, please.
Kostler.
Here.
McAlpine.
Here.
Kraus.
Here.
Chapman.
Here.
Cavelli.
Here.
Dudek.
Here.
Thank you. Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll now move to the public comment portion of the meeting. I don't think there's anybody here that's to talk about anything other than what's on the agenda, so we'll go ahead and close that. We have the October 4th, 2016 committee of the whole meeting minutes.
No, none.
None. Move that to the consent agenda. Thank you. Now we'll move to our actuarial projection. Mary, you going to start us off on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Earlier this year, village staff issued an RFP for actuarial services. We felt it was prudent to have maybe a fresh pair of eyes look at our calculations. The firm of Foster & Foster had been selected, and Mr. Jason Franken from Foster & Foster is here this evening to go over the actuarial report prepared for April 30th, 2016. So at this time, Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. As Mary mentioned, my name is Jason Franken, and I'm an actuary with Foster & Foster. My office is actually down in Oak Brook Terrace, so it's a little bit of a drive, but not too far to get here. So does everybody have a copy of the report? So my plan is I'll sort of hit the highlights to begin with, and to the extent that there's questions, I'm happy to answer those. I could stand up here and talk for a long time, but I know you'd probably get bored with it pretty quickly. So if everyone wants to open up the report to page 5, we completed the actuarial valuation as of May 1st, 2016. And on this page, on page 5, in the center of the page, we've outlined the results compared with last year's valuation. You'll notice in the right-hand column, the village required amount was last year was $720,351. It's increased up to about $816,433 this year. There were a couple changes that I want to talk about that we made to the valuation. The experience, though, wasn't great. The return for the year, the market return, was 0.25%, which is well below our assumption of 7.5% that we had been using. And so to that extent, when you fall short of your assumption, it does mean that your contribution requirements go up and your funded ratio goes down. So if you want to flip ahead to page 7, just quickly, there were two main significant changes that we made during the year. The first one is that we adopted a new mortality table. So the table that had been used previously was getting to the point where it's starting to get a little dated. Life expectancies have increased since the 90s when the data was the data that was used to create the table that was being used. So as a result, we've updated our mortality assumption. Therefore, people are living longer, and as a result, they're getting more pension payments, leading to higher liabilities and more contributions. The other thing is that we added administrative expenses to our calculation. To the extent that a plan pays administrative expenses out of the trust, it really is a liability to the plan that you need to fund. Historically, historically, that had not been part of the actuarial valuation. There were no expenses being included, so we felt that that was a necessary change. Flip ahead to page 9, just a couple things on the numbers. You'll see there are 3 columns here on page 9. The right-hand column is last year's results. Those were completed by the prior actuary. Then the middle column shows what the results here had we not made any changes, and then the far left-hand column shows where we ended up after the changes. You'll see that there was about $8.7 million of unfunded liability last year. It would have gone down a fair amount this year. Some of that has to do with the actuarial transition, but the liabilities would have gone down, and your funded ratio would have gone up to 56.5%. But after those changes, increasing our life expectancy, we end up with about $8.4 million of liability and a funded ratio that's just below 55%. On the next page, on page 10, similarly on this page, we show the before and after. Our contribution requirement last year was $720,000. It would have gone up just by $11,000 to $731,000 this year had we not made any changes. After the changes, you'll see it goes up to $816,433. So a majority of that is a result of the mortality change. But if you notice the administrative expenses that we did add $38,000 to the contribution requirement based on the expenses, and that assumption is, essentially we take the administrative expenses that were paid last year, include a year of interest, and then include it as part of this year's contribution requirement. So these assumptions, the mortality table was the only assumption that we changed this year. There are a couple other assumptions that we will consider changing going forward, and unfortunately, if we change both of them would have the impact of increasing the contribution requirement. The first assumption that we will review in the future is our investment return assumption. Currently, we're using 7.5%, and given some of the investment restrictions that the plan faces, earning 7.5% every year after year, is a difficult target. It's a difficult bar to reach. Most police pension plans in the state at this point are using 6 3/4 or 7%. So being at 7.5% is, a little bit on the aggressive side relative to the other police pension plans in the state. And to the extent that you lower your investment income, you need to make up for that with higher contributions. So by lowering your investment income, it does lead to higher contributions. The other one that we would want to address at some point in the future is our payroll growth assumption. So this assumption is used to determine our amortization payment. Our amortization payment is, if you recall, we had about $8.5 million, almost $8.5 million of unfunded liability. It's effectively a mortgage payment that we have to make year after year. And the payroll growth assumption determines what type of mortgage that you have. And when we have a payroll growth assumption of 5.5%, we are essentially, our contribution, our payment pattern assumes that our annual payment increases by building in 5 years of compounding increases for the next 25 years. So back when we're looking on page 10, the amortization payment in the far left column this year is $473,000. So if we were to follow that 5% increases out for the next 25 years, when we reach 2040, that $473,000 would increase to in excess of $1.6 million. So there is a lot of, by using a 5% assumption, you really are factoring or building in a lot of backloading into your contribution pattern. And we like to minimize the backloading as much as possible. Unfortunately, lowering that assumption leads to a larger contribution today. So it's not something that we're going to change and bring down to 3% or something overnight, because that would be, lead to a very substantial increase in your contribution requirement. However, we think it's prudent, from not only the health of the pension plan, but for the health of the village, that you put in more money today and lower your long-term obligation to the pension plan. Because to the extent that you defer those contributions, they just become more, and the plan becomes more and more costly over time. The last thing I want to talk about is, it starts on page 26, I believe, but if you flip to page 30 of the report, there are really two separate valuations that are included in this report. We have the funding valuation, which is what I've talked about thus far, that sets the contribution requirement for the plan. But then there's new GASB accounting requirements that have gone into place over the last year or so. And GASB is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. It determines how the village needs to account for your pension plan in your financial statements. And starting essentially this year, you need to book the unfunded liability of the pension plan on your balance sheet. And the calculation is different than what is required by the state of law, our state of Illinois law. What's in the state of Illinois pension code is not GASB compliant. So we really need to have two completely separate valuations, and that's included in this report. So on the top of page 30, you will see that the unfunded liability of the plan is about $8.9 million. And so that's the number that would go on the balance sheet of the village. This number is higher than what we saw earlier, where we saw $8.4 million of unfunded liability, just because it's under a different set of rules. And here we have to use the market value of assets when we're figuring out the GASB funded ratio. We can't smooth investment returns like we do under the Illinois pension code. The last thing on this page is the funded ratio is also different. We were showing 51.7% here. It was 54.7% when we were looking at it before, so it's 3% lower. The last thing I want to mention is before I open up to questions is on page 31. One of the requirements of GASB 67 and 68 is that we disclose some sensitivity analysis. So the sensitivity of the discount rate specifically. Using our current assumption, we're showing 8.9% of, or $8.9 million, excuse me, of unfunded liability. If we were to lower that assumption from 7.5 down to 6.5, you'll see that the unfunded liability goes from 8.9 million up to nearly 11.8. So that demonstrates the impact that investment return assumption or discount rate has on our calculations. If you just think about compounding interest, if you lower it by 1% in 50 years, it really does have a significant impact on the numbers. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions regarding the valuation or anything else regarding your pension plan.
If you might comment while the board is considering their questions, one item that can be confusing, the salary increases piece. Clearly our FOP agreement now, again, our pension fund covers more than just sworn officers, but we have, I believe, 19 or 20 covered in the bargaining unit, and we're not settling out at 5% salary increases. So for the benefit of the public, can you explain how that is framed? Obviously, that captures step increases, things like that, but how do you come up with 5%?
Yes, so once again, that's one of the assumptions that so there's really two separate assumptions. You have the salary increase assumption, which we use to project the pay at retirement. So if someone's age 30, we're currently compounding their salaries until they retire at 50 or 55 by 5% per year. So that allows us to estimate what we think their pay is going to be at retirement, and the pension benefit is based on that pay. So if you would lower that assumption, you would lower the liabilities to the plan. and vice versa if you increase it. The other assumption is the one I specifically mentioned earlier. That's the payroll growth assumption. That assumption is that's how the payroll for the entire department grows. And if you think about it, everybody in the plan could get exactly a 5% increase. So their salary, you would meet your salary assumption exactly because everyone got a 5% assumption. However, that doesn't mean that the payroll for the entire department is going to grow by 5% because you have people, the high paid people leave and they're replaced by lower paid people. So even though everyone got exactly 5%, the payroll for the department might increase at a different rate. Also, you could add more people, or you could have fewer people in terms of active members in your plans. So really, those two assumptions should be set separately from each other. Currently, the way it's been done in the past, the same 5% assumption has been used in both cases.
And just for the benefit of the public, the current labor agreement with the Fraternal Order of Police that I'm looking at, we did some resetting of entry-level pay rates, but roughly year 1 was a reset, but year 2 was 2%, year 3, 3%. I'm sorry, 2%, 2%, 2.25%. Those are the year-over-year increases. Again, the point is also, addition to what you said, we have some newer employees that by years of service. That is in addition to that 2%, 2% or 2.25%. So I just wanted that to be clear. These are pension assumptions, but the public does ask when they hear in sessions like this, and I believe this is the first time possibly ever that we've had the police pension report publicly presented. Previously, that hasn't been through a report to the board in public session. So I just want to make sure that that's understood by the public.
And just a little more on that salary increase assumption. So a flat 5% increase, we've discovered through working with plans not only in Illinois but across the country, is that public safety, the increases aren't really flat. It's not a 5% every year. So what we've recommended to most of our clients is to go to a service-based table that has higher increases early in the career based on service, and then as you get more and more service, the increases become smaller and smaller until after 15 years or so, you're really just getting cost of living adjustments, and there aren't really many step increases. So that is an assumption that we intend to address. And I think by adopting a service-based table, it's probably going to lower the liability of the plan. But on the other side of the coin, we have the payroll growth assumption, which I think also needs to come down. And since the plan is in, funded ratio is in the 50%, there's a fair amount of unfunded liability in the plan. So by lowering that payroll growth assumption, the impact actually outweighs the benefits that you would get by lowering the salary scale. So these are all assumptions that we intend to address before the next valuation. We didn't make all the changes this year just because of the timing of the transition when we were hired. We didn't have enough time to meet with all of the parties and provide the impact of changing the assumptions, because the last thing I wanted to do is show up tonight and say your contribution has to be increased dramatically, and without you being aware of it, and so I didn't want to present, have any surprises in year 1. Over the next 9 months or so, we will discuss these assumptions. We will measure the impact of any changes that we recommend, and then hopefully to come to some consensus before we perform next year's valuation. And then so everyone's on the same page and there won't be any surprises.
4.76% return on our money. It seems pretty low. Is that standard across the board?
Can you repeat the question, sir?
It says a 4.76% investment return.
So that's the return. So actually, let's flip ahead. I'll give you some more detail on that. So if you flip ahead to flip to page 19. So for our calculations, we smooth investment gains and losses over a 5-year period. So the purpose of it is to eliminate the volatility that exists if you're using market value. And depending on what happens with the market, if you have a bad year, your contribution could go skyrocket. In the next year, you have a good year, and it could go way down again. So the goal is to recognize gains and losses over a 5-year period. A lot of times the gains and losses offset each other. So you have a contribution pattern that's more smooth and predictable rather than a volatile contribution where you don't know what the contribution is going to be year after year. And so on page 19, it summarizes the calculations for the smooth return. And you'll see at the bottom of the page the actual return of the fund for the fiscal year ending on April 30th, 2016 is 0.25%. So it's essentially zero, not much above zero for that 1 year. The 4.66% return, that's the smooth return for the year. So that factors in that you're only recognizing 20%, or sorry, 20% of the loss every year. At the top of the page, there's this chart. You'll see that over the last 4 years, this year where we got 0.25%, there was a loss of $673,000. And keep in mind, this loss is relative to our assumption of 7.5%. It's not relative to zero. So the plan didn't lose $673,000. There was actual investment earnings were about $23,000 for the year, but they fell significantly short of what we were expecting based on our assumption. Last year there was a $255,000 loss. The year before that, there was actually a gain of $29,000. Then the year before that, there was a loss of $61,000. So you'll see that in 3 of the last 4 years, there have been investment losses. And part of that is due to the fact that we're using a 7.5% investment return assumption. So we have a pretty high bar. If we had been using 6.75%, the last 2 years, the losses wouldn't have been as severe. And 4 years ago, we probably actually would have had a small gain because we would have been above the 6.75, but still less than the 7.5. So in the 2016 column in our chart, you'll see that in the row that's called total, the plan currently has $692,000 of unrecognized losses. So that means over the next 4 years, we're going to be recognizing losses in the total of $692,000. So we are in a little bit of a hole, starting out in a hole this year, because we have to, before we get any good investment income, we have to wipe that out. So that's really a summary of how the smoothing works and where the plan currently sits in regards to the unrecognized losses.
All right, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I just have one question, and I might be wrong, but I thought one of the things we did last year, and correct me because I could be totally off on this, was I thought we made a contributions that we'd be over the 10 million in there, that we'd make better returns. Did
Just
that
this
occur?
month, we went
so we're
over the
just going-
10 million amount.
So
As you-
should that,
as-
is that counted in when you're looking at projecting here to the future, that now that we're over that, we should be able to be in more aggressive type of funds?
Well, he's thinking of his answer. Just the context, we have had a policy of when we clear years with surplus, and we've fortunately for the last couple of years been in that position. The board has a policy to determine where to take those dollars, whether to drop it down to fund balance or put it in a road program, or in the case of the prior year, we put $200,000 into the pension fund on a one-time basis. So obviously with market swings, last year went down some. there's some volatility. I'm just answering that just this month, according to our reporting, we just hit over the 10 million mark. And as I understand it, that you can explain better, there are some additional options for the police pension board to invest with once the municipality is above that ceiling. So go ahead.
Yeah, so once your plan reaches $10 million, you have more, there's more options for you from an investment perspective to get additional investment income. So now if you're above $10 million, you can invest up to 65% of the plan into equities, rather than, before you were limited to about 45%. So in theory, you can get a higher return, and that would justify a higher investment return assumption. My comments earlier about the assumptions being 6 and 6.75 or 7, those were for plans above $10 million. So for plans below $10 million, the assumption is generally 6.5 or even a little lower. So I had sort of made that leap already, because I knew you were, my understanding was that you were above the $10 million threshold. So for purposes of this valuation, we are, we're using 7.5%, even though we're below $10 million when most plans in that situation would use a lower 6.5 or so.
Okay.
But you're absolutely correct that now that you're above the $10 million threshold, there are additional opportunities to earn investment income that were not present before.
This is one fact point. In the 2012 budget discussions, we went from an 8% historic investment rate return to a 7.5%. So it was at 8% as late as 12.
Sure. Okay.
Who sets the 5.5% salary increase? Is that the pension board?
Well, the actuary is ultimately the one who's signing off on it. So I'm the one who's, essentially setting the assumptions. I do get feedback from, the pension board, the village staff to set the assumptions. So to the extent that there are specifics about your case that might lead to an assumption different than maybe someplace else, that information would be included here. So ultimately, like I said, I'm the one as the actuary who's setting the assumption, but it is really a collaborative effort to set that assumption with the pension board and the village staff.
I guess I'm looking at that as we're being conservative because that makes us try and save more money in the pension, correct?
Well, that one piece of it, yes.
But then at the same time, that leaves us on the hook for a larger liability, correct?
Yes. So using a 5% salary increase assumption, I will say is conservative. However, on the other side of the coin, we're being aggressive when we're looking at our investment return assumption and also our payroll growth assumption. So if we were to change all of the assumptions that I think need to be tweaked, if we were to make those change, it would lead to a larger increase. If you're just talking about the salary increase assumption in a silo by itself, then you're right.
And back up there a second, you said a larger increase in unfunded liability?
Yes.
And I'm just asking this because I'm wondering how this affects the village credit rating. So that big liability hanging over our heads, is that affecting our ability to borrow and what rate we're paying?
We're AA2 now, and obviously, as you get rated when you issue debt, we haven't issued new debt since the BAB bonds. Obviously, we all know pensions are coming up in ratings calls. Mr. Ducharme can speak more directly, but
Jim, I wouldn't believe.
please come to the mic.
Overall, at this point in time and where we are based on other municipalities, I don't know that this one component would necessarily impact our credit rating.
Okay.
And just to follow up on that, so rating agencies have their own measure for pension liabilities. And while this liability hasn't appeared on the face of the financial statements. It has been in the notes, and most rating agencies would have a calculation done already and have factored that in. So the fact that GASB 67, 68 says, okay, now you have to have it on your balance sheet, that alone doesn't necessarily impact your credit rating. From my experience, and it's limited because this is all new, it seems like most, in most cases, rating agencies are less concerned about the unfunded liability and more concerned about whether or not the municipality has a plan to deal with their pension obligation.
And an ability to tax, in theory, that may not have yet been put into place. You know, understanding the issues with taxation, however, they do look at sources, you know, especially home rule communities that have rights to tax, unlike us. They do look at those things.
Yeah, the city of Chicago is an example there. They haven't really had a plan to deal with it, and they have, given the amount of unfunded liability that exists not only in the city plans, but also the Cook County plans, rating agencies have said, well, they can't tax their way out of this because the taxes would increase by so much because there's 7 different pension plans that are severely unfunded. They have limited, you know, sources to get additional revenue. So in those cases where there isn't a plan, there's limited ability to generate new revenue, that's when we've seen downgrades, and it's less about just the number appearing on the balance sheet.
So my question is one that I addressed during the summer, and I wonder if you've done any work to this effect. If we got $8.5 million negative right now, roughly, give or take a little bit, would it behoove us to issue debt and bring that number to zero? And can our regular budget process, our normal budget process, handle the expected additions to the pension plan?
We did look at it. Michael or Mary, do you want to comment on issuing pension debt?
Rick, you could issue the debt, assuming you could have a referendum passed that would allow you to approve the debt. There are other issues that come up related to that because, yes, you find yourself being able to issue the debt at a fairly low rate of return or a low interest rate. But on the other hand, you turn around and take those proceeds, and what are you able to invest them at in order to increase your investment return, which would bring it closer to what your assumed rate of return. Now, the simple answer for me is, if we actually got to the point that we were considering it, Spear, who worked with us in terms of the special service areas as our financial advisor, we could have them run some analysis to show if we issued the debt at assumed rate of return, what we'd have to earn on the other side to make it worthwhile to us. Somebody could run those numbers, but I think the biggest obstacle in front of the village board would be having a referendum adopted to issue $8.5 million of debt for pension fund. And one of the reasons, I'll just give you one of the reasons why that would be. If you issued $8.5 million of pension debt, your chances of issuing debt in the future for any other purpose that you might want would be extremely limited. Example, if you actually were considering looking at a new village hall facility, a police facility, or something of the like, which normally you'd issue debt for, to be able to consider two issues like that would not be easily completed.
And the follow-up I have to that, because I was figuring you would say exactly that, Michael. There is no way to be able to have a defined source of revenue to address something like this without having to go to referendum?
Well, please understand, you currently have an electric utility tax, which you are using to pay off the BAB bonds or the bonds that were used for the road programs in the past. And when that debt is retired, you would still have that same revenue source and the revenue it's generating that you could then roll that into a new bond issue, which might not require a referendum, depending on what that amount was.
So the dollar amount generated through the electric utility tax would have to cover the debt service on, at some point it stops.
On $8.5 million.
Understood. Okay.
And then
Yes.
that revenue isn't available for other debt payment obligations like a police building. Is that
Well,
right?
again, one of the things that we've talked about in the past in one of these meetings was we have attempted to bank that electric utility tax, which currently is coming in an amount above and beyond the required debt service for those street improvement bonds. And our intent with that was that hopefully come 2018, 2019, which is before the final maturity, but the first call date on those street improvement bonds or those.
November
bonds,
19, yeah. And that's like 5 years earlier than what it could be. if
that
you
we
wait.
then could pay off the remaining BAB bond debt, which would free up that revenue source to allow us possibly to use it for a related issue or any other thing that you might be interested in at that point in time.
At this point, you don't have a gut feel for how much, if there was no BAB bonds, do you have a gut feel for how much the electric utility tax could take in terms of principal? How much could we generate?
What the total amount is per year?
No, how much?
No.
If we're getting X dollars from an
I
electric
see,
utility
from
tax,
that.
what does that equate to a loan?
To a loan.
I think
It's like
current-
600 grand
I
of
think
revenue.
initially, wasn't it 5 million? So the initial electric utility tax was projected to generate more than enough revenue to cover the $5 million debt service.
Please understand that that's a pretty light police building. Keep
That
that
is-
in perspective.
That is a pretty light police building, and the amount of the electric utility tax coming in from year to year continues to go down. So the amount, just to give you a quick answer without having run the numbers, odds are it would be $5 million or less that it would generate.
And that's why we have a building fund also for you that we've been saving dollars in, to help as well. Obviously, we're here to talk about the pension components, and these are all related issues because we're looking at multiple obligations at once. And while the board's finalizing its final questions, the point of this exercise is it's a workshop. There's multiple parts that go into decisions about taxation, also your budget workshops in February, March, but these are important issues over the long haul, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And this board is really digging into these nuts and bolts as we had all collectively discussed last year. You had testimony from the president of the pension board that came to you and said, can we look at some different options? It's why we, frankly got a new actuary that has more modern standards, in my opinion, and is also helping us to look at this from a 5, 10, 15-year horizon. So not all this has to be solved tonight, but it just needs to be, contextually understood. And as he mentioned, as we expected last year after going through audit and then last year's dialogue on the pension assumptions, we expected to be in this position from the standpoint of the added years people are living, et cetera. And so here we are, and now it's, how do we fold this into the probably 5 to 8 different big picture decisions you need to make over time?
And I don't mean to remind, because I don't know if it's bolts or if it's nuts, but the $2 million annual Myers payment is going away. And I know that's a considerable part of our annual budget. So, and we do have a referendum on the November ballot. It's advisory, asking if the taxing bodies in the village limits of Cary should have a referendum to raise taxes. And something tells me that that'll pass handily. So that's something to think about as well.
And just a little more about the pension obligation bond. So if you were to issue enough money to wipe out the unfunded liability of the plan, let's just say, that at that date you would be 100% funded. But that doesn't mean that that you don't have a contribution going forward. On page 10, roughly half of the contribution, well, a little less than half of the contribution is due to the unfunded liability. So that would be going away. And so your annual contribution requirement would go down considerably. It would go from 800,000 to probably about 400,000. But there still would be an annual $400,000 payment that would be required. Otherwise, you would just be falling behind again. Sure. And so that's one thing that I've had these discussions a couple of times, and people think, well, we issue the bond, we're good. No, you do have active police officers who are earning a pension. You need to continue to fund that. Otherwise, you will just be creating unfunded liability. The other thing that has happened in a few cases is just the timing of the issuing of the bonds. And if you have a 7.5% target and you can't reach that target, in the future, as you accumulate investment losses, you're going to be generating more unfunded liability, and your contribution would start going up again. So I think there were some plans in Illinois who issued pension bonds sort of the beginning of the 2000s, and then we had a decade where the market was flat. And in those cases, they thought they were going to be in really good shape, but a decade later, when the investment income wasn't there, they found themselves with rising pension costs again. So those are just a couple of things to consider when you're thinking about doing those kind of bonds.
Can you remind us again when the unfunded mandate, what level it has to be funded at and when the date is?
Yes, so currently what's in the Illinois Pension Code is that your funding, you have to be 90% funded by the year 2040.
2040, okay.
What the approach that you've taken in the past is to ignore the 90% and say we're going to be 100% funded. We're on the hook for the entire obligation. Why are we setting a lower target? So our contribution requirements that are being generated here are to get to the 100% target, not the 90% target.
Oh.
So by Illinois statutory laws, you could contribute less than what we're showing here. I don't recommend that because what's in the Illinois Pension Code in terms of the funding methods, it is very backloaded, and pensions are pay now or pay later, and the less you pay now, the more you're going to have to make up in the future. And that's what's happened, with the state plans in Illinois, is that they were deferring the payment. They've been deferring the payment for decades now, and you get to a point where the obligation is so large that it seems almost impossible to deal with it. And that's the situation you want to avoid the best you can today, so you're not creating mountains and mountains of unfunded liability 15, 20 years from now, where it's too late and there's nothing that you can really do to contain it.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question, Mayor, but I think that in preparation for the next budget meeting, you really ought to sit down, Michael, and yourself, Chris, and come up with some applicable models that the board could look at, whoever the board is at that time, because this ain't going away. And it's a big number, and it's not going to get smaller. And, you know, the next item on our agenda is talking about a 3-year budget process. This gentleman's talking essentially about a 30-year budget process, which is, you know, considerably more difficult to come up with some sort of handle on. And, you know, whoever's sitting in these chairs this time next year, I hope they don't have the same kind of conversation without some data to make a decision. I had the same question as Jim about the bond rating. I mean, how much would that cost us if the bond rating went down and we did need to go to a village hall or a public water treatment plant, you know, and you needed $10 million? If it was 1/8 of a point, that's real money. So this has got to be planned for, and the board needs to have examples of ways to be able to maybe not get it at 100%, but, you know, I suggested to you earlier when we had the potential for the Meyer money back in May, let's take the money and put it against this. And I mean, you remember me having that conversation with me. It would make a big dent against a big number. Doesn't get us all the way there, but it certainly makes it more tenable long-term. And the board just needs that information, has to have some examples.
And if I may, one thing we've been doing with a lot of our clients is exactly what you're talking about, having a discussion about the long-term funding of the plans. So the way it's designed, the way you're currently designed, your funding is designed, is that it increases, your contribution requirement increases dramatically between now and 2040. Then once you reach 2040, you go to essentially zero. And that's what's been in the Illinois Pension Code. You hear the Edgar ramp, but what they don't talk is what happens when you get to the end of the ramp. Well, we never get there because they keep moving the date back. And one thing that we've been recommending is going away from that target, that 2040 date, and putting something in place that's more reasonable. And I say it's unreasonable because this plan is going to be around longer than 2040. And so why are we funding, assuming this arbitrary end date, and essentially not allowing any contributions beyond that? And so what we've done is we've developed a model where it's an interactive model. You can change various inputs and see how it impacts your contribution requirement. But we're recommending going away from that 2040 date and coming up with a 15-year rolling amortization. So you're always amortizing everything over a 15-year period. And so you're not necessarily getting to 100% by any specific date, but you don't have to be 100% by 2040. That's just what, or not even 90%. That's just what the Illinois Pension Code tells you. However, I would much rather have a system where you're gradually moving up in the right direction and eliminating your unfunded liability and containing it, rather than what's there currently, where you have this negative amortization where your payments aren't large enough and your unfunded liability grows, and then right when you're going to start paying it down, you refinance and add 7, 10, 15 years to your payments, and you're right back in the same place. So we are doing that elsewhere, where we're having these planning sessions. So it is something we could work with you on if it's something that you're interested in.
Great report.
Thank you very much. A lot of
Thank you very much.
Now we'll go to a discussion regarding a 3-year budget projection. Mary and Michael, who's going to start us off on that?
In your packet, you have kind of a combined mid-year budget review and a 3-year financial forecast. The schedule that's in here, I just want you to realize, is just a summary schedule. I mean, there is a revenue schedule, there's an expenditure schedule, there's an expenditure summary schedule, and all of the pieces and all of the detail is there. It just would have inundated you with a bunch of schedules, which would have been hard to go through at one point in time. Our intent in putting together a 3-year forecast is to see if there's a trend that pops out. And clearly, going through the exercise for the Village of Cary and looking at a 3-year window, there are a couple things that pop out. Number one, there is a deficit that is in place for the current fiscal year, estimated to be $133,000. And it's projected to be upwards of 700,000 2 years later. There's a couple primary reasons for that, or one specifically. If you look at the amount of revenue being generated from year to year in the next 3 years, there is virtually no revenue growth that we're seeing in the Village of Cary. Part of that was our own doing in putting together the forecast, because last year when we did the property tax levy, there was 0% increase in the property tax levy. Knowing that, and because we didn't have the information from McHenry County for this year as of yet for our tax levy discussion, there is 0% increase projected in there for the 3-year period. The reason that we went out 3 years and why it's important that you see that there's a $700,000 deficit in year 3 is, number one, so you have time to react to it. If we got to the 3rd year and we told you there was a $700,000 hole in the budget, there simply aren't enough revenue sources in a non-home rule community to raise $700,000 in the course of 1 year. This at least provides you the opportunity to consider a multitude of things that hopefully will be able to plug that gap between now and 3 years. The next step that was listed in here was the fact of, as a non-home rule community, you of course know we are subject to tax caps. So the amount of property tax dollars that can go up for any reason is very small. The other 2 options that come to mind are the 2 that I've listed here in the form of an eating establishment tax, a natural gas utility tax, which would be similar to the electric utility tax that was adopted a few years ago for the bad bonds. The eating establishment tax, based on information that we have from the Department of Revenue related to the Village of Cary specifically, projects that that number could be close to $200,000 a year. I've shown it as $150,000 because there are eating establishments in the Village of Cary that would not be subject to the eating establishment tax. And the best way I can define that to you is the fact of restaurants are excluded if in fact they don't have seating. So if you just have a counter and people come in and take out food, if you don't have any tables there, you wouldn't be able to impose an eating establishment tax on it. The other thing that I want to make clear is the figure that I came up with for a natural gas utility tax is based on information we received from NICOR, but please, it also assumes that the tax would be at a 5% rate, which is the maximum rate we would be allowed to do it. And I just want you to know that because you don't have to necessarily impose it at a 5% rate, but at 5%, that's what it would generate. Going back a little bit to this forecast, the reason that we get to $700,000 deficit in 3 years comes about from the fact of we have ongoing labor contracts in police and public works. We have non-union increases that have been given. We have annual increases that will come about due to health and dental insurance for the most part. That's where we see them. And based on our discussion earlier this evening, I have plugged in that we're going to need at least $100,000 a year additional each and every year for the pension contribution. The reason I picked $100,000 is because to lower our estimated rate of return from 7.5% to 6.5%, a span of 1% in lowering that, we were given an estimate that it's 10% of annual salaries. Annual salaries for the sworn personnel in our police department are approximately $2.1 million. If I was to reduce or take 10% of that and drop that estimated rate of return by a full percentage point, it'd be $210,000. I figured if we at least were to consider possibly in the future going from 7.5 to 7, that's $100,000 right there. And that's the $100,000 that's plugged in here. There may be some other adjustments, as Jason talked about. We'll have to look at those as they come about. He couldn't give us an estimate of those at this time. The next point that's on our list, and which we're going to be dealing with later on this fall, is our annual tax levy. In the past, and I understand it, the board has taken the stance that as much as possible, we would like to keep those increases as close to zero as possible. I get that, I understand that. But I do want to make the board aware of, starting this year, I believe, although I haven't seen the numbers yet, with property, increasing our assessed valuation, with the possibility in the future that we may have the Sage expansion that's there. When the new growth component comes up that we receive from the county for tax levy purposes, I would suggest that that is something that the board needs to consider, which we haven't necessarily considered in the past. And the reason I stress that is because we've had the discussion before that with new growth, you only get one opportunity. The county shows it to each and every year as new growth. If you don't take advantage of it in that year, it's not like you could say, oh, I'll just wait 2 years and I'll go back and pick it up then, because you've lost the opportunity then. Once it's added to the total assessed valuation, then it's all subject to the tax caps. The new growth is kind of above and beyond any tax cap measure that's sitting out there. And so especially when we're seeing those additions to the tax rolls, that is something that we not only will point out to you, but hopefully we'll talk about it more in the future. In the past, when we've looked at the tax levy, last year we didn't increase it at all. In the past, the increases we were able to take went from $50,000 maximum that we were allowed due to new growth and the CPI to as little as, I think it was $30,000 in one of the other years, and that was only related to the new growth, I believe. The other thing that I wanted to point out with the forecast, so as not to mislead anybody, this analysis that was done only took into account the general fund expenses. As you all know, when we went through the budget exercise last year, in our capital projects fund, in our road improvement fund, our intent was that we were going to take those dollars that were available in fund balance and utilize those this current year for outstanding capital projects. I'm not saying 100% of that money will be totally used up this year, but a vast majority of it will be. Which means if the board were to consider any capital projects for next year, whether it was just the normal things that come up that you see in the form of the budget, items like the downtown renovation, items that come out of police related to updating the radios that we need to go to the STARCOM system. Any of those expenditures for capital projects would need to be funded from some other source than we've used in the past. The most obvious source of that is the general fund. And I say that because that's really the only source that's sitting out there that would allow us to transfer funds from it into the capital projects fund.
Good point, Mike. I just want to clarify one point. Obviously, we've got a train station job that's funded out of the commuter parking fund, so that's a side
Yes.
effort. You've got a wastewater improvement for 1.3 million to the plant. That's out of a
Totally
different
separate.
fund. He's talking about, by example, and I want to make one more point.
Please.
The motor fuel tax fund by plan has $1 million in it for planned roads for next year that include $900,000 for Georgetown, which we need to do because of the SAGE project. So we've got a basic road program, we've got a train station job, we got a wastewater project. He's talking about
Other,
$1 million for the downtown for streetscape or enhanced road resurfacing beyond the million in MFT, you know, any kind of building project that would not be funded out of the building funds, stuff like that. So,
the reason that I say that is any transfer required for those capital projects out of the general fund would be above and beyond the deficit numbers that I've shown you here. There was no way at this point in time, midway through our current budget year, that we would have all that information from departments to be able to provide you with the number at this point in time that would have given you a better understanding of what that deficit might be. The purpose of, as I said in the past, of going through this exercise is just number one, based on the information we have today, to make you aware of where we think this picture is going and provide you with the information that you may need for you to decide what you want to do in order of meeting that deficit.
so the point tonight is to lay out, you know, not doomsday, but to be clear that we just need to be thoughtful way before March of competing priorities, pensions, capital projects, building goals, other general fund related components that's important. As a side note, as Michael has outlined, you know, by calendar and by rule, I plan to bring to you November 15th, not your next meeting, which is at the Crystal Lake Holiday Inn for other business, frankly. But November 15th, you know, we typically would be making a decision for voting, you know, as soon as the first meeting in December on the tax levy. And historically, we bring you a chart that has a myriad of options, 3-4 options that include machinations tied to the EAV growth. We can't find out what the EAV growth is before the 1st of November anyways from the county and township. So unless there's any issues, I'd like to tell you that we could agree maybe tonight that, you know, committee of the whole on the 15th, we decide, you know, with options in front of you, you know, how to proceed with the levy. And then understanding that that requires a vote. I always like to have that be the first meeting in December. I never like to have it be the second meeting in December because it has to be done by the second meeting in December. We always like, historically, we've done decision-making informally the second meeting in November, and then you're voting the first. So unless there's an objection to that, that's what I plan to do. As has been pointed out, I mean, there's PTEL cap, there's EAV that we'll find out, and then there's 0%, right? So obviously, off the board floor, things can come up from that at committee level. So any issues with that approach?
When do we talk about the possibilities for reductions in budget? When are those factored in? Is it after you give us?
What kind of budget reductions?
Well, I'm not ready to say right now. I just want to know any. I haven't heard anything except for we need to increase our taxes. And I do have some ideas about ways to reduce the budget and to bring them up again this year.
Sure.
And I just want to know when that happens. I don't want to have it get past the time where we're ready to vote for the annual assessment and then say, oh, I got some ideas. I'd like to get those out to staff now. As a matter of fact, I would have liked to have known a little bit more and then maybe be brought in. But regardless, I just want to know when we can bring those things up and how much staff is going to help, or how much do we have to do ourselves in order to bring these?
I can't answer it because I don't know what you're talking about in
Okay.
terms of
All right.
issues. And what I can explain is that we have budget workshop in March,
Yeah,
and we're not telling you got to raise taxes with this 3-year plan. What we're explaining is this is an estimate. And when you forecast, you make reasonable assumptions about commodities, fixed contracts, things that you know that are locked in stone, that are tied to health insurance in our pool. This is a projection.
Absolutely.
This is not telling you got to do this or that.
and I wouldn't
And
be talking about those.
if I can finish, I would just like to explain, this is a forecast. This is looking 3 years out. It's not telling you what to do. But if we don't look 3 years out, we can't make tactical decisions whenever, or budget time or workshop time, mid-year budget. I mean, it's important to me as the administrator to look 6 months into the fiscal year at where do we expect to end April 30th. And as we do every year, by standard operating procedure, we make mid-course corrections so that if we can avoid it, we don't have a $130,000 upside down number at April 30. These are standard, every year municipal things that we do. If you have specific requests, whether or whatever it is, you just need to say it. And we're glad to debate those things. But those are not red herring type things that just take 700,000 away. And there are operating pros and cons with some of those things that we have to consider, et cetera. I don't know what else that it is that you have. Glad to hear those things out from you and try to help you through the committee process, talk about what it is that you got.
Anything else for Michael?
I neglected to add one other thing, just because it came up earlier this evening. Meyer Material. There is $1 million currently under the contract that we received that has gone into, or $250,000 a year goes into the vehicle replacement fund.
Well, historically it has.
Historically, it has. That when those funds stop coming into the village, those funds that have gone into the vehicle replacement fund was the funding source for the new vehicles. So I just want the board to be aware, if that funding source were to stop, that we would need a new funding source down the road for those vehicles.
Michael, I did have a follow-up question before we stop. And if you're not prepared to give me an idea or give everybody an idea, that's okay. Can you explain to us, the PedCorp project is going to be coming online this year sometime, right? First occupants will start going in?
Yes.
Sometime
This
soon?
quarter.
Okay. How, and it's an 18, whatever it is, $1 million project. That impacts EAV, correct?
Yes.
How does that come into EAV? Does it have to be 100% occupied before 18 million comes to the EAV? Will it be over the period of time of occupancy? Those two things are something I think we all should know, because it's going to happen, whether you like it or not, it's going to happen. And then secondarily, if you took the numbers from last year, and I recognize we don't have the new EAV numbers and all that, but there's some multipliers that I think you get when you calculate all this stuff. If you took the most current number that you have, that we have, what would $18 million in EAV mean to the village of Cary in terms of income?
First off, I don't know that number, only because I was unsure of when the timing would come about related to the 18 million.
You mean the occupancy?
Well, no, what I'm used to, and please, I came from Cook County much more so than McHenry County, but generally in a sizable project, it's generally done in pieces. So they'll have like a partial assessment, which may be based on some of the construction or some of the amounts that were originally laid out in the building permit. And then there'll be a portion, another sizable portion, that may come as much as a whole year later before you see the remaining piece to it. The part that I'm always interested in is the fact of when we know there's a piece related to new growth, determining what it's for, so we don't make the assumption, oh, this has to all be related to this, because if, with the development that's taking place in the village of Cary, not necessarily all of it large development, you'd like to see the individual pieces that are being added to it, so you know that everything is accounted for.
I agree with you. I'm asking this, and I think it's real important to try to at least get an idea for a specific reason, and I think there's some historic perspective that needs to be shared to everybody here. I came onto the board just shortly before the economic scenario that we had for 7 or 8 years was in place, when really nobody saw anything going on, right? As far as I know, when I moved here in 2003, when we still had good times, I would bet that from 2003 to 2017, which is when I'm guessing the Garden Place apartments will be 100% occupied, this town hasn't had $18 million of cumulative EAV growth. In fact, it's probably gone down. So to me, this project, when Sage comes on, assuming that happens, if some of the other large ones, the Pearl project, if that ever comes around again, you know, and I don't mean to, I hope no one takes this personally. It's not a question of if you like it or not. It's impactful. And it's the only stuff that's gone on here since 2003 when I moved in, other than a Burger King with 50 million signs on it. So we should know as a board what the impact of that kind of development is, because Chris, when you go to have a 3-year plan, or we sit next March or April to do a budget, there's going to be some impact of that. And I think that's important, because that, if it was $1.8 million, I wouldn't ask the question. It's 10 times that. It has to mean something. And after that presentation, if the pension thing didn't scare you this time or previously, it should have scared you today.
I appreciate those
We
comments.
this board has to plan for that sort of thing, and it needs to know from you and folks that work along with you, what are the impacts of some of these things?
This is definitely, you know, the next level of planning here, separate from comprehensive planning. This is real financial planning.
It's why we
And-
have a pension plan that's so screwed up, because boards, way before any of us, didn't do that. That's
And-
exactly why we are in the place, and the school districts and every place else, because they never did financial planning.
And I'll say that, and I'm just appreciate Trustee Chapman's comments. What I need is help looking at it in a non-emotional way, laying things out, okay? Please understand, we've reduced police officers in Cary in the last 2 years. We didn't need to debate it with our pension actuary, but there are 2 fewer police officers here than there were before, for reasons that were made by the board at the time, which I recommended and still do. So there's 65 employees when I started 5 years ago. There's 58 now. There's some contracts that came back to fill some of those gaps, but there was 90 employees here in 2005. So the boards have dealt with these things through difficult economic times. Now we need to take a step back, take a breath, and try and figure out how to piecemeal this with the resources that we have. It's not the agenda to raise taxes. However, it is to say in advance of making decisions to kind of think about, well, how does it all fit together? That's what it really is about. And that we need 7 people to help us do that. So thanks for those comments. That's all.
I wasn't going to make a comment, but Rick, I appreciate what you're trying to say with all this, and I was trying to stay away from the PEDCOR argument, and you brought it up, so I just had to go there. What you're saying is the village has a potential of getting more income from taxes because PEDCOR is worth $18 million to the village. What that says is that the people of the village will be taxed more because of that development. Potentially.
How do you figure that?
Right? If there's new growth and the board approves new growth,
Correct, right.
then they would incur
Yes, you're
higher
right. Agree.
taxes due to
Agree.
it,
Yep. Mhm.
right? So I think we have to be very careful with that because the board that I wasn't a part of promised that this wasn't going to cause higher taxes. So I think you need to be very careful. Otherwise, these deficits are very real, and I would like to discuss this at length further. I'm a little bit caught off guard by some of these numbers. And I'm looking at this $133,000 deficit in the current year, and I'm going, we're giving a lot of money away. And on top of that, I'm wondering where the Meyer fine money is in all this and how that
It's not in
equates.
there.
It's not in there.
Okay.
That's
So-
separate.
It's in a total transfer, wherever
It
the
could-
funds
then that
were
could-
going.
That could change.
Transfer it.
But whether that be recommended for general, I mean, that's up to the different discussion, but it's not in there.
Okay, I would just like, and this isn't
Yeah.
for everybody here, but maybe Chris, if we could sit down and discuss this a little bit more at length before the budget meeting. I don't want to walk into the budget meeting and we have to make a decision right
Sure.
there. So,
Jim, could I add just one thing, just to the point that you made related to the PEDCor development? PEDCor does have a value attached to it in terms of what that assessed value is. When the county classifies it as new growth, they take that value, and that value from that piece of property technically is being paid by that property. So the amount, even though the value of that property is being added to the tax rolls, the amount associated with that value is being paid for by PEDCor. So the ultimate cost to the remainder of the tax base at that point in time is zero.
the amount is being paid by PEDCor.
What I'm saying is,
I'm not following.
there is the tax bill generated by that PEDCor property is being paid by PEDCor. Not,
Right.
not the remaining citizens of the village of Cary. So when they give us that new growth, the 18 million related to that,
Mhm.
and that tax is being paid, the total tax for that project is being paid by that project. The impact on the remainder of the taxpayers is zero. Do you follow me? I'm not in.
I don't, so you're saying that even though, it doesn't even matter what development it is, it doesn't matter if it's PEDCor, it's SAGE,
Right.
whatever. You're saying that if the value of whatever is put on that land, whatever it's assessed, and it increases the value of Cary,
Right.
that whoever owns that land is paying for that?
Is paying the
Yes.
taxes, just like you.
Well, they're
pay the
paying
taxes.
property taxes, but they're not, what I'm saying is we're talking about increasing the new growth with PTEL, and that
No.
comes out of,
I'm only talking about the new growth that comes from projects like that.
Let me try to take another shot at it differently and
I'm sorry.
essentially, correct me if I'm wrong,
Okay.
but the pie is X,
Mhm.
right? And whether it be its name, if we're explaining the EAV clearly, the pie is bigger to the same dollar amount.
Yes.
So he's saying that, unless you, and it might be a policy decision that you want, you want to not tax for that extra larger piece of the pie. You can choose to do it that way, but you get one shot to do it or not. And whether it be a Dunkin' Donuts or a PEDCor or a SAGE,
Right.
that's building that base, so there's more entities paying in for the same amount of money. And is that correct?
Yes, and
yeah,
Jim,
but that's, okay, so if you have one more property owner paying taxes, then that doesn't spread it out so that everybody else's taxes don't go
well,
up.
but Jim, I think the point that I want to make is, under that scenario that we were talking about, just new growth, the only time I believe that we'd be talking additional taxes on residents of the village of Cary is if we chose to increase, let's say, that CPI portion that we're allowed to increase it. Then, if we increase the levy by that CPI amount, then again, that increase goes out to all of the property owners in the village. All of the property owners are not faced with any new growth that comes from a single project that's being added to the tax rolls.
So by capturing the new growth, which is, as we were explained a couple of years ago when we voted to do that, is if, let's just say that that new property that's coming on, and we vote to capture new growth, and their tax is $8,000 this year, they will give us a check for $8,000. That's the first year, and that's what happened to Kim, I think, is their house came on.
Okay, but Dave just did it further.
Yeah,
That 8,000 that you're referring to, if that's the tax bill,
yeah.
that 8,000 is then divvied up to all those taxing bodies. So whatever their
Oh, right.
proportionate share is, the school district's going to get its 65%, and the village is going to get its 5%, and the park district is going to get their share.
Yeah.
And that's how the $8,000. But it was a new $8,000.
Right, it wasn't from existing
It wasn't
residents
from
that
any
live someplace else.
Exactly.
There you
So
go.
all we're talking about here are just those new projects that come along. And that's why, please, we can have this conversation as many times as people like until we're all comfortable with whatever the outcome is.
And I also want to comment quickly, because it was also mentioned, I believe, the question about funds that were changed post-budget. It is correct that the decision about the gaming proceeds that went out to community events, that was post-budget, so that 30,000, it would be 100,000 theoretically in the red instead of 130 if we wouldn't have done that. But the fact is that, I'm going to say again, you know, we typically at mid-year have some mid-course corrections to make. You know, I'm not saying it's easy, but I believe that I can make some mid-course corrections like I always do. And I also want to point out to the board, the prior board, including a number of trustees on the finance committee that we had at the time, including Trustee Kaplan by example, was adamant that we should, as a village, be spending 100% of budget. We had previously been spending 85 to 90% of budget, so we were always off. So it took us a couple years to get calibrated to be at 100% spend. So this isn't, you know, I understand red numbers are concerning in the one-year horizon, but this is by design that we do it this way. So we spend what we ask for and don't ask for more. And so I don't want to have the 130 be that alarming. I understand that the grants were provided, that's a part of that, but I wouldn't have, you know, sat here and said, you know, go ahead if I didn't think there were some things that we could do. Obviously, we'll work with the department heads on that.
Now, Chris, can I just make one final
Yeah.
comment? And it's to kind of help Jim out with a little bit historic perspective. For 10 years, I've gone through this project with whoever was in charge of our finance department, Ron, Mary. The annual tax levy has been, for me personally, one of the most frustrating things I've ever done as an elected official, because the vast majority of the board has never understood it. Never understood it, including a few people on the board right now. So I wanted to have Michael give us a piece of information about PEDCOR, not because it's PEDCOR. I could have said SAGE, the same thing. There's an impact to that which we need to understand. And in the past, board members, including some on the board right now, have said no to new development. And I've mentioned that in probably my whole 13 years here, we haven't had $18 million in EAV happen. And if you take the approach of not adding the new development, to Michael's point, and then listen to the individual that was talking about the amortization, the negative amortization of a pension fund, if you don't take it today, how much worse are you making the financial position of the village of Cary by not at a very minimum, at least including the new development? I mean, I think that's a fiduciary responsibility we have to the residents of Cary, because to Michael's point, once it's gone, it's gone. And it doesn't fall on your shoulders. So why wouldn't you include it? And I don't want to debate it. I just want to clarify. If it was SAGE that was taking occupancy November of 2016, I would have used SAGE in my example. It just so happens that PEDCOR is the development that's starting to take occupancy next month. So I'm asking him for the impact of that development. You substitute whatever the heck name you want to substitute. the issue is still the same. This board, these board members have to understand the importance of including, at a minimum, the new EAV that comes on board. It's very, very important.
Just as a matter of fact, just a quick, when you were mentioning that some of the new growth that we, in like 2013 or 2012, 2013, 2014, they were elevated a little more. It's because of the Three Oaks Assisted Living that we recaptured.
Oh, yeah, yep.
So that was, if we didn't capture that at that time, we would be that much further below where we are right now.
It's just, I raise that only because knowing there are decisions that have to be made in the future, there are so few opportunities that we have being a non-home rule community that will allow us to generate funds to keep moving. And to Trustee Chapman's point, in the memo that's there, one of the first things that we laid out is we will always look to cut what we can based on what's in the existing budget. Sometimes when you get to $300,000 and $700,000, then you start getting to amounts that require more than cuts.
Sure. Well, thanks for clarifying that. I just wanted that, that's a good fact. I'm glad that's out there.
Thank you. I'm going to, Chief, we're going to table your constituent.
Exciting.
You just got to rein that in because we'll talk about it at the board, okay? All right? I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you.
You don't have to talk.